Hello, I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Today our topic is why your periods are not stopping. This is a topic that I get asked all the time, and I want you to understand that your life can be balanced when it comes to female hormones. There are thousands of women that I have worked with in my practice, from little young girls all the way up to elderly women. I want you to feel like you can get control of this. There are always going to be exceptions and outliers, but by far, most people can get control of their periods. I don't know if you know this, but the typical period of actual bleeding lasts 3.5 days, 3.5 days around the world. So if your cycle is about 28 days long and your period of bleeding is 3.5 days, that is the typical normal. And throughout the world, throughout all the different cultures, all the different races, all the different countries, all the different climates, that is normal. And so you might be surprised to know that not only is 3.5 days of bleeding normal, but it's continuous bleeding, starts and continues and then stops. It doesn't have any interruptions. You don't stop and start. It begins and it ends. It goes from the first day to the 3.5 days. That is the general consensus around the world, and that's healthy bleeding. If a person has a 5 to 7 day period, which is pretty typical in the United States, they're going more than twice as long as they should. And this is a problem of hormone dysregulation that mostly comes from food. It can come from stress, but it comes mostly from what you're eating. This is a lifestyle problem. We can fix it. The difficulty is that when a young lady has a problem with her period lasting too long and bleeding too much, she can get anemia, she can get tired, she can get fatigued, she can be really ornery and cranky and feel terrible, not know why it's happening. And doctors may give herbs, doctors may give drugs, but the most common thing is they put them on the birth control pill. And I think that that is a major mistake, to say, well, we're not doing this for control of conception, we're doing this for control of periods because it's just out of control. And instead of looking at root causes, they give up and they medicate. That is the first step on the cycle of becoming dependent on the medical industrial complex, and I think it's a bad idea. I don't know if you do, but I'd like to know what you think. So if you want to fix this, we need to look at how the system works first. There are two ovaries, one on the right and one on the left, and they tend to alternate, so that if you're healthy, 1 month you release an egg and the one ovary is quiet, and the next month the other ovary releases an egg and that first ovary is quiet. So it's kind of like this. It alternates left, right. Month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4. And as you progress, your body releases those and the other side is quiet. It is true that sometimes you may have a double release. It's true that sometimes you may not ovulate. There's all kinds of things that can happen. And ovulation can be interrupted by any number of things, from being deeply in love, from having a breakup, from having a stress, from having a head trauma, from having a car accident. There's all kinds of things that can interrupt the cycle, but it usually gets back in order pretty nicely. If you're exposed to the moon and you're exposed to good food, your body will typically regulate. And if you're exposed to other women, your body will typically regulate too. You'll be able to get everything back in order and have things working together. General two problems are mostly a woman has problems before her period and feels relief, and or she has periods that are problematic and they last too long and the problems are during the period. Most of the time, when a person begins to get out of order, their periods are okay, but they have PMS. PMS happens that week before your period is when all the symptoms happen, and then the period begins and you feel better. That's pretty typical. When things get worse, the periods tend to get longer and there's cramping during the periods, and that's a bit more difficult. And the basis for this is that all of the hormones in the female system should be down to 0 right before the period begins. That's the reset point, and that's when the period is signaled to begin. And if everything's working right, and there isn't too much problems with blood sugar and cortisol and deficiencies and toxicities, then everything works, the period begins, its course for 3.5 days, and then it stops. And there shouldn't be massive chunky periods, there shouldn't be problems with excessive bleeding, there shouldn't be a need for massive pads, tampons, there should be a reasonable amount of bleeding. So we want to have you get basic blood work and talk with your doctor if things aren't quite right, but you should be able to get control of these things. And by far, almost every patient that we have worked with that's premenopausal, that's before menopause, has been able to get control of these things without drugs. So I want you to know there is hope. It's more difficult to control female symptoms after menopause, but it's pretty easy to do it beforehand. Let me tell you why. The PMS symptoms include, and you probably already know these, insomnia and hypoglycemia. irritability, tender breasts. By the way, fibrocystic breast disease is about 30% of American women, and that's just unconscionable. We need to stop that. There's no reason for American women to have 30% of us have fibrocystic breast disease. Breasts that feel somewhat like cauliflower under the skin, where you feel a hard mass under the breast. It can be on one breast or the other. It tends to happen where it waxes and wanes, it comes and goes. It's often made worse by sometimes coffee. I'm not saying that coffee is bad, but sometimes coffee stimulates it, and a person may need to change their caffeine intake or their intake of other foods and lectins, which we'll get to. But this is something we really need to attack, because a lot of people get really scared that they're going to have breast cancer, and they're just getting fibrocystic breasts, which is an expression of diet very, very commonly. There is some genetic component to this, but almost always it can be controlled by doing a better job of dietary and toxin control. There may be spotting on and off during the premenstrual time. A woman may spot during ovulation, which is, 2 weeks before the period, for that couple of days. She may have a little bit of blood that comes out during the ovulation. There may be a lack of focus where she can't focus, or she has no endurance. She has bloating of her abdomen when she eats nearly anything. There can be weak immunity. The weakest times of the female immune system when you're out of balance tend to be at the 2 days of ovulation and the premenstrual time. Women tend to be strongest when they're not ovulating and when they're not having the premenstrual week. So when their period begins and after, and then that short period of time after ovulation. So there's 2 spans where they're really strong, and there's 2 spans where they're more weak. And the 2 spans, again, where they're more weak are ovulation and premenstrual time, right before the period. There can be lack of libido, there can be fatigue, there can be acne. It's not uncommon for a woman to get the estrogen ring, where they get acne around the ring of the face and down into the chest and back. I see that often with toxic milk products and with corn syrup, with sugar. They make acne from the expression of testosterone and imbalanced androgens and imbalanced estrogens, and they get much more facial infections. They get aggressive, and they get premenstrual cramps, and they also get cramps during the period. So sometimes the cramps happen before the period and then they're relieved by the period, and other times they're worse during the period. And so we can balance those by working on all this stuff. The periods usually relieve the symptoms, but if you have continued painful cramps, that's a symptom that you haven't been able to reduce all those hormones. That means that your intestines and your liver are not able to reduce the production of those estrogens and progestins and testosterone. That means that we've got to balance the diet. We need to look at estrogen and progesterone curves. As time passes, your period has ended, and then a week goes by to a week and a half, and then ovulation happens. Right before ovulation, there's an estrogen peak, and progesterone's pretty quiet, and then ovulation happens, and then estrogen goes down and is a little bit higher than it was before. It's like this at first, and then after ovulation it's a little higher, and then progesterone goes really high and comes down during the second half. That's part of why women feel so good after ovulation and before their menstruation. They feel much better because of that massive progesterone. That massive progesterone is tightening of the skin, and it makes a person feel very youthful. It makes them get rid of water weight. They don't feel so water retentive, and they don't feel so soft and sometimes soft and weak like they do sometimes with estrogen, which happens before ovulation. And that's not what it should feel like, by the way. That's only with excess. You should feel good during both before ovulation and after ovulation. So these estrogen and progesterone curves look like this. Estrogen goes like low, peak before ovulation, and then kind of higher, and then nothing. And then that's when the period begins. Progesterone is low, and then ovulation happens, and then progesterone is a big lazy curve that ends at the beginning of the period. And that's what you'll see on your curve in front of you. Blood sugar drives free testosterone and estrogen and fat deposition. So if you have high blood sugar, if you have insulin resistance, if you have reactive hypoglycemia where you get hypoglycemic, low blood sugar, and then you get cranky and you eat a bunch of sugar, that burst of blood sugar is going to drive fat cells. It's going to make you gain weight. It's going to make you have excess estrogen, and it's going to give you high free testosterone. It's going to give you polycystic ovarian syndrome and painful ovaries, ovarian cysts. It'll give you uterine fibroids and give you the production of excess estrogen. These are alternative views, and sometimes your medical doctor may not always agree with me. This particular process is something that lots of alternative doctors have worked out, and many books have been written about the subject. We'll get to the defense of that later, but right now I want you to just understand the mechanisms of how alternative doctors look at this. The solutions are to identify hypoglycemia. If you have to test your blood sugar, if you have to wear a continuous glucose monitor on your arm or your belly, if you have to poke your finger with a glucose glucose monitor and check yourself. That's useful. Sometimes you may need to snack more often. You may need to balance your cells by giving yourself more minerals and more protein, more healthy fats like saturated fats. You may need to deal with insulin resistance by having reduced carbs and reduced lectins. Some people eat fruit and honey for that to make it healthy, and some people just totally reduce their carbs. To decide whether you've got to be a low-carb person in keto or carnivore versus a person that can stay on carbohydrates and use sugar from fruit or honey, that's another discussion that isn't for today, but that's something that we talk about. And we'll talk about that in another video. You could have mineral deficits. Boron is very important for female hormones, and so is lithium and trace minerals like manganese and molybdenum and magnesium, zinc, copper, all these things. Saturated healthy fats, we need saturated healthy fats that come from animal products. I think that's very important. That's not a bad thing. We want lower carbs, especially from grains and beans and nuts and seeds. We want to stress management the adrenal system, which is to say women need to know that there is a triad of the adrenal system, the thyroid system, and the female hormone system. So the ovaries and uterus, the adrenals, and the thyroid gland are extremely important in the female hormone system. It's not as important in men. It's easier for men to get through this, but females tend to have a much bigger problem, such that if any of those organ systems are imbalanced, they mess up the other systems. So if your thyroids mess up, it screws up your adrenals and your female hormones. If your female hormones get messed up, it screws up the others. So you have to look at all three together. So you might need a test of your adrenal hormones from saliva or urine. You might need a thyroid test of your blood, and you might need to look at your iodine levels in your urine. There's all kinds of ways to do this, and you should talk to your doctor about that. Sleep hygiene is a big deal. If you're not sleeping well, you might need to review your sleep habits and look at why you're not sleeping. Sometimes your sleep problem comes from your estrogen imbalance, which is fixable from food, and sometimes your stress comes from not sleeping, and you have to tighten up your sleep discipline. So look at your sleep hygiene, get rid of the EMFs, turn off all the electrical magnetic fields around your bed, get blue light blockers, and turn on all your blue filters so that you see more red light in the latter half of the day. You wind down, you go to bed on time, you give yourself a sleep ritual. You make sure you don't do excessive arousing things that get you messed up and angry or upset before bed. That's very important. Chiropractic care. Boy, I can't tell you how many women have said that Atlas Chiropractic, sacrooccipital chiropractic, Logan chiropractic, sacrooccipital chiropractic, lumbar chiropractic, all kinds of chiropractic methods balance their nervous system and balance their hormones. There are many women, in fact, entire cultures like the Amish that use, and the Mennonites that use chiropractic to balance their reproductive systems every year as part of their farming cycle and their reproductive cycle to get balanced. Acupuncture and cupping. Cupping is the suction on the back, and it kind of causes these temporary bruises. That's poor man's PRP, or platelet-rich plasma. It's a great way to activate and pull plasma elements out of the blood and activate your immune system, and really it works great for people with allergies. It works great for people with female hormone disorders and stress. I get cupping and I think it's a great thing. Get the lead out. Get rid of heavy metals. Heavy metals can really screw up the female hormone system. Toxic fat cells, if you've got toxic fat cells and you've been losing weight too rapidly, sometimes you may have to slow down and work on detoxing your liver and your blood. Sometimes you may have to work on toxic fat cells and fasting. You may be losing weight too fast, and it's okay to lose a lot of weight on, for example, a ketogenic diet, but you may want to do more detoxification. You may need turmeric, you may need boswellia, you may need milk thistle, which is silymarin. This is extremely useful in helping detoxify. You may enjoy N-acetylcysteine, NAC, or glutathione. These can be nebulized and breathed. They can also be taken by mouth. These are extremely useful for detoxifying excess estrogens that come from the environment, called xenoestrogens, that are man-made, because nearly every fat-soluble poison in the environment is a xenoestrogen, and that can mess up your periods. So you need to detoxify those, whether it's toxic fat cells, rapid weight loss, you're burning all the toxic fat out of your fat cells, and you've got to get rid of that stuff. So sometimes you may have to take a break from losing weight and detoxify your digestive system and your liver. Remember that pesticides and herbicides do carry these xenoestrogens because they're fat soluble. They come from essentially petroleum products. They come from petroleum and drilled out of the earth. These are fat soluble materials that dissolve in your fat cells, but they're derived from petroleum. They're pesticides and herbicides like glyphosate and other organophosphates. These can be 700 times or more potent than your own female estrogen, and they can contribute to cancer as well. Men's testosterone cream. If you're a female that is around a male and that male is using testosterone replacement cream, that replacement cream could be on towels, it could be on sheets, it could be on pillowcases, it could be on clothing that you share. If you wear his t-shirts, if you use his washcloth and you're not washing things properly, you could get testosterone from that man's testosterone cream. And I see that all the time in my patients, where suddenly I do a hormone test of blood or urine or saliva, and I see testosterone through the roof from a woman, and I ask, does your husband or your significant other have a testosterone cream? And she says, oh yeah. And even in women that are being super careful, this can show up in, wearing his slippers, wearing his socks, wearing his bathrobe, any type of clothing that has had that testosterone cream, sometimes even cuddling with him after he's put on that testosterone cream anywhere on his body. Once it gets onto your skin, it can really be sucked in by the female system. Cosmetics. The cosmetics are the worst thing because the labeling laws in the United States don't say that you have to label them as estrogens. So if you've got cosmetics, you have to be very careful to talk to the manufacturer and find out if those cosmetics have hidden estrogens, because by law, they don't have to tell you if they put estrogens in the cosmetics. And they do that because estrogens bring water to the tissue and they plump up and soften the tissue, which is great. So women put on this stuff and they say, oh my God, look at my face, look at my lips, look at my eyes, look at my cheeks, everything looks just great. Well, that's because in some cases they've hidden estrogen and estrogen-like molecules in the cosmetics. So you've got to be super careful. Fragrance. Anything that you use in your life, if you're using these terrible plug-in odor blockers, I'm not going to name brands, but if you're spraying breezy stuff on your pillowcases, all of that is petroleum and it's got fragrance in it that is xenoestrogen, and you may have xenoestrogen from cosmetics and fragrances. Plastics. If you have problems with plastics, you may be exposed to microplastics from your Tupperware, from your plastic lids and containers, from your plastic coffee mugs, your plastic toothbrushes falling apart, all the different plastics that we're exposed to in our lives. Everything that's made of plastic, our cooking utensils, these all degrade and they go into microplastics and they go into our body. Those microplastics exude xenoestrogens. Packing your food in microplastics, packing your takeaway food or your leftover food or your food from a restaurant, very often that gets put in some kind of cardboard, paper, or styrofoam that's lined with some kind of terrible chemical that keeps it from seeping onto your clothes or onto your car upholstery. And that's convenient, except that it's usually some pretty toxic coatings that go into these food containers. So watch out for your takeaway food containers and watch out for that problem, because those can affect your female hormones too. I hope you've enjoyed this rather comprehensive review of some of the causes and solutions from a natural perspective without having to take the birth control pill to regulate why your periods are not stopping. Let me know what you think.